everybody. Welcome to the Fiscal Year 2014 Family Self-Sufficiency Program NOFA webcast. My name is Brianna Benner, and I'm here with my colleague Darren Dorset. We both work on the FSS team here in HUD headquarters, and we're going to be sharing this presentation with you today. We have a lot of topics to discuss. I'll be discussing all the topics on the left-hand side of your screen right now, and Darren will take over for the second half of the presentation, and we will take questions at the end. Okay, so let's start with the basics. The FSS NOFA was published last Wednesday, April 23rd, and it's due on May 29th before midnight. Your applications must be received and validated by grants.gov by this deadline date and time. Also, we have a total of $75 million available under this NOFA. So please make sure that you read the entire NOFA carefully to make sure that you're meeting the threshold and the eligibility requirements. Otherwise, you will not be eligible for funding. And you must also read the Fiscal Year 2014 General section carefully. You have to read both of these documents because it's the General section combined with the NOFA that comprises the full set of the application submission instructions that apply to this program. You can access both of these documents and the entire application at grants.gov. You can also access the NOFA and the General section alone at HUD's Funds Available page. So let's talk about some of the major changes this year. The biggest one is that we have combined funding. In the Fiscal Year 2014 Appropriations Act, Congress combined the funding for the Housing Choice Voucher Family Self-Sufficiency and the Public Housing Family Self-Sufficiency Program into one. So whereas in prior years we've had different funding amounts, different NOFAs for HCV FSS and Public Housing FSS, this year it's just FSS. We're only issuing one NOFA, applicants submit one application, and you're going to get one award. Any applicant that has gotten 2 awards in the past, one for HCV FSS and one for Public Housing FSS, is only going to get one FSS award this year for all of their coordinators. All meaning both the HCV and the Public Housing coordinators. So the funding under this NOFA is eligible to be used to serve both public housing and HCV FSS participants. So that coordinator can serve both kinds of families now under the Fiscal Year 2014 funds. Another change this year is that we're going to be using a grant agreement and HUD's LOCKS system, that's the line of credit control system, for all awards. We've used grant agreements and LOCKS for public housing FSS in the past, but we've never used it for HCV FSS in the past. Instead, we had used an amendment to the PHA's annual contributions contract, the ACC. So instead this year we're going to be using LOCKS and the grant agreements for everybody, and we'll talk more about that later on in the presentation. So one of the other changes this year is eligibility. HUD will only be funding applicants that currently administer an FSS program, that meet the threshold requirements, and that also meet one of the following 3 criteria. The applicant must have been funded under the Fiscal Year 11, 12, or 13 FSS NOFAs, either the HCV or the Public Housing. So basically this category is for those who were funded for FSS in one of the prior 3 fiscal years. The second category is you received an FSS program through a transfer or consolidation from a PHA that was funded under one of those last 3 NOFAs. Or if neither of those apply to you, you could also be eligible if you made a commitment to provide vouchers under the Rental Assistance Demonstration, RAD, to provide choice mobility commitment vouchers to the covered project-based rental assistance, PBRA project, of a PHA or mod rehab owner without a voucher program. I know that's a mouthful and that might be kind of confusing. Basically, what it is that the RAD notice specified that we would give priority to new positions for PHAs who made this choice mobility commitment. So most PHAs who are going to be applying under this NOFA have not made this commitment, and it's not applicable to you at all. It's just there in case there are any PHAs out there who made this commitment, who haven't gotten FSS funding in the last couple of years. You could be eligible if you made this commitment. And I'll talk more about this category a little later as well. So we have different funding priorities this year. Last year, we only funded renewal positions, and that was it. This year, we're prioritizing funding for renewal positions first, but if there's money left over after we fund all the eligible renewal positions, we're going to open that up for new positions as well. Renewal positions basically means any position that was funded under the Fiscal Year 11, 12, or 13 FSS NOFAs, either one, either the HCV or the Public Housing NOFAs. And new positions are those positions that were not funded in the last 3 years under an FSS NOFA. Some other changes, and again, I'll be discussing more about the funding priorities further on. So some other changes that we've made this year are that we've included a list of common mistakes that PHAs made last year as Appendix A to the NOFA. So look at that appendix. We're including them here just to help people out and make sure that nobody makes those mistakes this year. It's not an entire list of everything that could go wrong in your application. It's basically just some pointers to help you out. Another thing that we did differently this year is that we're including Appendix C to identify which housing authorities made this choice mobility commitment I referred to earlier. This is PHAs that made a rad choice mobility commitment to provide vouchers to a PBRA project of a PHA or a mod rehab owner that doesn't have a voucher program. And if you look at Appendix C, you'll see there are only 2 PHAs there. If any applicant is reading that list and thinks that's wrong, that this is I'm not on this list and I should be, you have to notify us before the application deadline date. Us, meaning HUD, contact us at fss@hud.gov before the application deadline date if you think Appendix C is wrong. So another change we're making is that we're including the PIC report this year at Appendix D. The PIC report is something we included in the NOFA last year as well, but there are some differences that I'll get into as we move along in this presentation. So another big change that we made this year is that we're announcing our intent to rate and rank applicants next year, so that's with the fiscal year 2015 FSS NOFA. Instead of just doing straight renewals, we're going to be actually rating and ranking applicants based on based on the amount of participants' increased earned income. And the reason that we're doing that is because increased earned income is one of the primary goals of the FSS program, and we want to make sure that we're prioritizing funding to programs that are the most successful in increasing their participants' earned income. And there are a lot more details about this in the NOFA, including what that means, what increased earned income looks like, how we're calculating it, how we would compare PHAs to each other. So I encourage you to please read those details in the NOFA and give us any feedback that you have on this proposal. You can give your feedback to us at fss@hud.gov. We've already gotten some feedback from some PHAs, so we look forward to getting more. Another change that we've made this year is that VMS reporting has changed. VMS is the voucher management system, and this is only applicable to grantees that have HCV FSS participants, and we'll discuss those changes later on in the presentation. So now I'm going to start getting into the details. This on the screen in front of you is a list of the criteria to be considered an eligible applicant. And I discussed this earlier on in the presentation, but just make sure you review that before you apply, because if you don't meet one of these 3 criteria, you're not eligible for funding under this NOFA. Also, we have some restrictions on joint applicants this year. Any eligible applicant who did not apply jointly under their most recently funded NOFA cannot apply jointly under this NOFA. That means if you applied last year on your own, you can't grab another PHA to apply with this year. Another restriction we have on joint applicants is that if you applied jointly in the most recently funded NOFA, you can't add any new joint applicants to your application. However, you could remove any of the applicants if you wish, or you could change a co-applicant to a lead applicant or vice versa. Also, if you applied jointly under your most recently funded NOFA, you cannot apply separately this year. So if PHA A and PHA B applied together in fiscal year 13, they cannot apply separately under 2 separate applications this year. So let's get into what kind of PIC data we're using this year. We're using PIC data that covers the target period of January 1, 2013 to December 31st, 2013. This is the period that HUD will be using to review data in PIC to verify the number of participating families and other relevant information for the NOFA. We include that data in Appendix D of the NOFA. Appendix D, again, is the PIC report. This is where we're listing this is where we're listing PIC data for the PHAs and the tribes or TDHEs. And besides the PIC data, we're also showing which FSS co-applicants you had in your most recent funding year, if you had co-applicants. We're showing the number of FSS coordinators supported by PIC. We're showing the cap on number of renewal positions, and we're showing the cap on funding amount for renewal positions. So I'm going to go into next what those caps are. Basically, the cap on the number of renewal positions is the maximum number of renewal positions that you would be eligible for under this NOFA. The way we calculated this number is by adding together the number of renewal positions you had under the HCV FSS program plus the renewal positions you have under the Public Housing FSS program. For example, if you were most recently funded for one HCV FSS program coordinator and you were recently funded for 2 Public Housing FSS program coordinators, your cap would be 3. We're adding together the 2 plus 1. What is your cap on the funding amount for these renewal positions? We basically added together the funding you received for each of those positions. So, for example, if an applicant was awarded one full-time position at $67,839 in the fiscal year 2013 HCV FSS award, but they were eligible for $69,000 prior to proration, and the same applicant's most recent Public Housing FSS award was for one full-time position at $65,000 in fiscal year 12. We're adding together $65,000 for their most recent public housing position plus $69,000 for their most recent HCV FSS position. We're considering the 2013 HCV FSS award as the amount before proration. So $69,000 plus $65,000 is $134,000 for this example PHA. That would be the cap on the funding amount that they can receive for their renewal positions. So no PHA will get more funding than this cap, and the cap is listed in Appendix D. It's another reason it's really important to look at that PIC report at Appendix D. So once you've reviewed Appendix D, you look it over, you may find that you have some questions about it, which you can certainly email us about, but I just want to point out there are 5 categories of applicants who are required to submit documentation with their application to confirm the correct number of HCV FSS and Public Housing FSS program participants during the target period. If you fall into any of these 5 categories, you have to submit this documentation with your application. The first category is if you are requesting more renewal positions than the number of FSS coordinators supported by PIC data, as listed in the PIC report. And I will give an example of that on the next slide. The second category is if your data is missing from the PIC report, but you are eligible. If you are an eligible applicant and you're just missing from the PIC report, you need to include documentation with your application. The third category of people that need to submit this documentation are tribes or TDHEs. The fourth category is if you are applying for a new position. And I'm going to talk about applying for new positions in a little bit, but anybody who is applying for a new position under funding categories 2, 3, or 4 has to submit this documentation with their application. Also, if you are a RAD PHA that converted any public housing FSS families into the HCV FSS program or to PBRA assistance during the target period, so during calendar year 2013, you are required to submit this documentation with your application. Okay, so this is an example of the first category on the previous slide. This PHA is showing that they have 28 HCV FSS participants. They have 6 public housing FSS participants, and that supports 1 renewal coordinator. However, you can see their cap on number of renewal positions is 2. That means they're eligible for 2 if they had enough families to support it. So if this public housing agency wants to get 2 renewal positions, they're going to need to submit documentation to us in their application that shows that they have enough families to support 2 positions, because what's in the PIC report, Appendix D, is not supporting 2 positions. The NOFA contains explicit instructions on what that documentation must look like. For example, you need to include 1 list for your HCV FSS participants and another list for your public housing FSS participants. You need to include their names. There are other requirements, so please look in the NOFA for this information. So how do you know if you have enough families to support your renewal positions? I'm going to talk next about the number of families served and the formula we're using. As in prior years, eligibility will be based on the number of FSS program participants in your program during the target period. Similarly, like former years, the formula is 15 families supports 1 part-time position, 25 families supports 1 full-time position, and you need an additional 50 families to support each additional position beyond the first full-time position. For example, if you want 2 full-time renewal positions, you need to have 75 families. If you want 3, you need to have 125 families during the target period. One way that this has changed significantly this year is that we're applying this formula in 2 different ways. That's because of the combination of the funds this year. Because the funds are combined, we're going to be applying the formula separately to your public housing and your HCV families, and we're going to be applying the formula to your families overall. And for renewal positions only, we will be taking the higher results to make sure that no PHAs lose coordinator positions this year due to the combining of the funds. This taking the higher of these 2 results only applies to renewal positions. For new positions, we're only using the second calculation on this slide. I'm going to describe next what each of these calculations means and how it works. So the PHA in this slide, if you look, they have enough families in their Housing Choice Voucher program to support 1 full-time position, and they have enough families in their public housing FSS program to support 1 full-time position. So if we apply the formula separately, they get a total of 2 positions, 1 for their HCV FSS families and 1 for their public housing FSS families. That's applying the formula separately. That's the first calculation. The second calculation only looks at families overall. And when you look at it overall, they only have enough families to support 1 full-time renewal position. That's because overall, you would need 75 families to support 2 renewal positions. Just as I explained on the prior slide, for this year only, this public housing agency would be eligible for 2 positions because we're going to be using the higher of these 2 calculations. We'll be using calculation 1 to say that they do have enough families to support 2 renewal positions. That's this year only. Next year, this housing authority and any housing authority in a similar situation is going to need to increase the number of families in its program if it wants to keep getting funding for those positions. So under the fiscal year 2015 NOFA, we're going to be looking at only the combined number of families. And if this public housing authority doesn't have at least 75, they're not going to be getting renewal funding for 2 positions. And that's, they need to have 75 families during the target period of next year's NOFA. Okay, so next I'm going to be talking about the different funding priority categories that we have going on this year. There's a lot of information on this slide. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this slide. Basically, I described earlier that we're going to be prioritizing funding for renewal positions. And if there's any money left over, we're going to be providing that funding for new positions. There are 4 categories in total. The first funding priority category is for renewal positions. Funding categories 2, 3, and 4 are all for new positions for different types of applicants. Categories 2 and 3 are looking at applicants who have the choice RAD mobility commitment priority that I discussed earlier. Remember, these are the PHAs who are listed on Appendix C of the NOFA. They're given priority for new positions due to the language in the RAD notice. There are funding priority categories 2 and 3. Funding priority category 4 is new positions for any applicant that does not have the RAD choice mobility priority. So that's most of our applicants. Virtually all of our applicants, except a few, would be in category 4 if they're requesting a new position. So how does this work? Basically, every applicant who wants a new position submits 1 application. You don't submit 2 applications, 1 for your renewals, 1 for your new positions. You just do 1 application, that's it. HUD will know that you're requesting both renewal and new positions because of the way you're filling out the application form, the HUD 52651. So please follow the instructions in the NOFA carefully when filling out that form. So you fill out the form that indicates to us if you're asking for renewal positions only or if you're asking for new positions. And we're going to go through and give out all of the money in funding category 1 first. And if we have so many eligible renewal positions in funding category 1 that we don't have enough money to fund every renewal position in funding category 1, we're going to have to equally prorate every award for those renewal positions. If, however, we have money left over after we fund all the renewal positions that are eligible, we will move on to funding category 2. and then it'll just keep going down. So if we don't run out of money in funding category 2, then we'll move on to funding category 3. If we don't run out of money in funding category 3, we'll go on to funding category 4. So once we're at funding category 2, this is for new positions for applicants with that RAD choice mobility priority, folks listed in Appendix C, who also were funded under the 11, 12, or 13 FSS NOFAs. So these are basically renewal PHAs who have this RAD choice mobility priority who want new positions. Funding priority category 3 is for PHAs who also have the RAD choice mobility priority, but they were not funded in fiscal year 11, 12, or 13. They're not renewal PHAs because they didn't get any funding for FSS, either the HCV FSS or public housing FSS in the last 3 years. That's what funding category 3 is for. And again, funding category 4 is for all new positions for every other housing authority who does not have that RAD choice mobility priority. So how are we determining who gets funding first in each of these categories? In funding category 2 and 3 and 4, we're doing a round robin approach. And funding category 2 and 4, we're ordering each of the applicants who are requesting new positions by their staff to client ratio. And folks with the staff to client ratio that is the lowest get funded for one position first before we go on to the next lowest. And we go through everybody. And then if we still have funding left over, we'll go to the second position they're requesting in that order. And staff to client ratio, a low staff to client ratio is just representing that you have a very high caseload. We're looking at your funded staff compared to the number of families you actually have participating in the program. And remember, anyone who's requesting new positions needs to submit documentation with their application to say how many participants they have in the program. We're not going by PIC data in Appendix D for new positions. If you are requesting any new positions, you have to submit documentation with your application telling us how many HCV FSS and how many public housing FSS participants you had during the target period. So that's how we're funding the order in funding categories 2 and 4. The funding category 3 order of funding is a little bit different because these PHAs don't have any funded positions. So instead of using a staff to client ratio, we're just using the size of their program. We'll fund by the largest program size first and go on down the list like that. Another thing I wanted to mention about these funding priority categories is that anybody who's requesting to go from a part-time position to a full-time position is basically requesting a new position. So if you have a renewal position that is a part-time position and you want to increase that to a full-time, what you do is you request that part-time position under your renewal position section of the application form, and then you request another part-time position as a new position. And that part-time position that is the new position will be considered in its appropriate funding category, whether that's 2, 3, or 4. So anyone who wants to go anyone that wants to take a renewal position that is currently part-time and bring it up to full-time is basically asking for a new part-time position. And anybody who is asking for any new positions has to have the number of families in the program to support that. So if you are asking for, if you have one renewal position and you're asking for one new position, you have to have 75 families in your program total to support that. Okay. I'm going to be moving on to eligible activities. Under this NOFA, we're basically funding the same activities we have in the past. We're funding salary and fringe benefits for FSS program staff. You can also hire a part-time program coordinator. As I mentioned in the previous slide, program coordinators can be part-time. And you could job share. So if you get full-time, if you get funding for one full-time coordinator, you could split that between 2 part-time people if you want. And the big change this year is that funding under this NOFA may be used to serve both public housing and HCV FSS participants. However, everyone needs to be quite careful to note that any funding you still have from any previous NOFA, so any funding you have that was made available under a fiscal year 2013 or earlier public housing or HCV FSS NOFA can only be used to serve the applicable program participants. So fiscal year 13 or earlier public housing FSS money can only be used to serve public housing FSS participants. Fiscal year 13 or earlier HCV FSS funding can only be used to serve HCV FSS participants. There is an exception to this for RAD, and I'm going to explain that on the next slide. For RAD conversions, if you're converting to PBV, or you have converted already your public housing units to PBV through RAD, you're allowed to use either your public housing FSS or your HCV FSS funds that were made available under any earlier NOFA to serve those public housing FSS participants who live in units that converted under RAD and as a result will be moving to the HCV FSS program. If you are converting any of your public housing units to PBRA, you can use any of the funds under this NOFA or any of the public housing funds made available under earlier NOFAs to serve those participants who live in units converted by RAD. And if you need more information on FSS and RAD and how that works together, there are more details in this NOFA, and there are more details in the RAD notice as well. So what happens when a participant moves between public housing FSS and HCV FSS? That could happen with RAD, or it could happen otherwise. A public housing FSS family could be on the HCV waiting list, and they get to the top and they get a voucher, and they're going to be moving over to the HCV program. They don't have to exit the FSS program. What happens is that they'll be receiving a new FSS contract, but the contract will have the original beginning and ending dates of their original contract, and it will have their baseline annual income, earned income, and family rent from the original contract. Then if they had accrued any escrow before they moved over to the new program, they're going to have two separate escrow accounts. And please look at the NOFA for more details about this. So what activities are ineligible under this NOFA? You cannot, just like in prior years, you cannot use this money to provide services to the FSS program participants or to provide any administrative activities. You can also the FSS coordinator cannot perform routine HCV or public housing program functions unless those functions enhance the effectiveness of the FSS program. Also, you cannot compensate coordinators for home ownership functions that they're performing for families that are not in the FSS program. And you cannot use these funds to pay for a contract administrator. All right, so I'm going to review salary comparables. Just like in the past, any position that you're requesting under this NOFA, you have to have evidence on file at your office of local salary comparables that justify that salary. And please note that HUD does reserve the right to request those local comparables at any time. And let's talk about the salary caps on each of these positions. They're the same as prior years. So this year, we will not be funding any full-time position for more than $69,000. And we will not be funding any part-time position for more than $34,500. Remember, you need to have your salary comps on file for whatever you're requesting. And this bottom of the slide states that there will be no salary increases in fiscal year 2014. What that is referring to is the salary cap. There is no increase above $69,000 for a full-time coordinator or $34,500 for a part-time coordinator. However, please note that you could request the salary amounts in a different combination than you had in the past if you want, and it meets some requirements that are described in the NOFA. Let me give you an example. Let's say your cap on the funding amount for renewal positions is $100,000. You're not going to get more than $100,000 for your renewal positions. But let's say that $100,000 came to you because last year you had an HCV FSS coordinator funded for $60,000, and you had a public housing FSS coordinator funded for $40,000. This year, you could request that each of those positions be funded at $50,000 if you want, because that still totals $100,000. It's not more than your funding cap for your renewal positions. You must have salary comps to justify those amounts on file. And $50,000 is not more than the salary cap, so that would be allowed. Okay, now I'm going to be going into this general section requirements. This year, there are only 3 threshold requirements in the general section. Those requirements are that you can't be an ineligible applicant, your civil rights matters need to be resolved, and there's a consistency with the consolidated plan requirement. However, please note that that consistency with the consolidated plan requirement is not applicable to this NOFA. And although they're not listed as threshold requirements, please remember that you must have an active DUNS number and an active SAM registration to receive funding. Okay, there are 8 other requirements in the general section that are not listed as threshold requirements. They're listed as other requirements, and they're listed on your screen here. I'm not going to be going into all 8 of them. However, I do want to note that 4 of them were threshold requirements last year and are not threshold requirements this year. They're simply requirements. And 3 of those 8 total requirements, of the other requirements, are applied a little bit differently in our FSS NOFA. The no debarments or suspensions requirement doesn't apply to the applicant itself. What it does apply to is any funds that the applicant receives under this NOFA cannot be used to pay somebody who is debarred or suspended. The conducting business in accordance with ethical standards / code of conduct requirement is applied a little differently in our NOFA. The requirement that we have in the NOFA states that you have to maintain your code of conduct in your administrative plan or your ACOP. You do not need to submit it with your application. And the other of the 3 that we modified in our NOFA is the pre-award accounting system survey. Basically, we state in the NOFA that if the local HUD field office determines that the applicant does not have a financial management system that meets federal standards, the local HUD field office may consider that applicant to be high risk, and they may require the applicant to enter into a recovery agreement with the HUD field office. The recovery agreement may include contracting with an entity acceptable to HUD to act as the contract administrator for the program. If the local HUD field office requires a recovery agreement, the recovery agreement must be executed before the funds will be dispersed. Please remember to read the general section very carefully. The general section and the program NOFA comprise the full set of application submission instructions that are applicable to the program, so you do need to read both. Okay, I'm going to be turning it over to my colleague, Darren Dorsett.
Good, thank you, Brianna. Yeah, you did an excellent job covering several other program-related requirements, such as eligibility, funding, those type of things. Again, applicants, please be mindful of everything that you said, and please go back and look at the PowerPoint presentation that has been provided. I want to take a few minutes this afternoon to talk about a few technical items that we're going to cover today. First, as you are aware, applications must be submitted via grants.gov before or on the application deadline. The only exception to this is if an applicant has requested a waiver to the electronic submission requirement. There will be no waivers granted if they are not submitted to FSS at HUD.gov, if they're not submitted 15 days before the application deadline. So if you're getting a jam, you're 2 days before the application deadline date, and you're seeking a waiver, more than likely that will not happen. In fact, it will not happen. Okay. As you're aware, applicants have to apply via grants.gov. First thing that you want to do, you can search the application by either the CFDA number, which is 14.896, or the funding opportunity number, which is FR 5800N-08. The next thing that you want to do when you're at grants.gov and you have found the correct grant application that you're searching for, you want to click the application tab. Before you do that, look at the View Grant Opportunity Information. You want to make sure that this is the grant that you're actually intended to apply to, 14.896, and do a quick look over and make sure again that this is the application that you want to download. A few important things to remember. You always have to press that download option. It's not automatically going to appear. You have to click download. Once you press the download option, it'll give you a prompt. You can either download the application by entering your email address, or if you don't want to include your email address, simply click on the checkbox. It says, I do not want to submit my address, and press continue. Once you press download, you'll be prompted to 2 important parts. Forms are found on the application package download and also in the application instruction download. Again, we want to make sure that you download both the application package and the application instruction package to ensure that you complete all of the required forms. First, I'm going to talk briefly about the application package. The application package, those are your standard forms that you've already seen. For example, the SF-424, the HUD 2880, which is the applicant Applicant Recipient Disclosure Update Form, the HUD 96011. Again, you want to use this if you're faxing any documents with your application. You'll also see two optional forms, the SFLLL and an attachment form. And again, you want to use this if you are attaching any documents to your application. As you click on the application package form or that link, again, those mandatory forms are already open and they'll be available by scrolling down the page. You no longer have to move forms from the left to the right or right to left. But again, if you're using an optional form, you want to make sure that you use the checkbox. Let's talk about how to use the application package. Again, as I just mentioned, as soon as you select the application package, these standard forms will appear. You'll see in the mandatory form section, the application for federal assistance, the SF424, the HUD 2880, as well as that HUD facsimile transmittal sheet. You'll see at the second portion the optional forms, the SFLLL, as well as the attachment. So please note the application forms that you see on your screen. Number one, the SF424, which is required. The SFLLL, which is an optional form. Number three, HUD 52651. Again, this is the meat of your application, the FSS application form, and again, this is required. Number four, HUD 2880, the HUD Applicant Recipient Disclosure Report Form. Again, this is also required, and we'll talk about this shortly. You'll also see the HUD 96011, again, which is the facsimile cover sheet. Again, it is required even if you don't submit any faxes. Next, you'll have the HUD 96010, which is the logic model. The majority of you are very familiar with the logic model. Again, it is required for this year's application as well. And the seventh item you'll see is the attachment form. Again, if you're submitting attachment with your application, please make sure that you use this option. This year, you'll have fewer forms, yet you are no longer required to have the HUD 2991, the certification of consistency with the consolidated plan, or the HUD 52752, the certification of consistency with the Indian plan. The code of conduct is not required to be submitted at the time of this application. However, please remember the applicant that you shall continue to maintain a written code of conduct in the PHA administrative plan and or the admissions or continued occupancy policy, the ACOP, that Brianna mentioned earlier. This year, no recovery agreement or contract administrative partnership agreement is required at the time of the application. However, if the local HUD field office requires it for applicants who either FOS or CMAP trouble, or applicants that do not have a financial management system that meets federal standards, funding will be contingent upon the execution of one of these agreements. I want to speak briefly about the SF Form 424. SF 424, please do this form first. Again, as you complete this form, it'll populate other sections of your form. Let's go to question number 2. Type of application. Please select New or check the New checkbox. Question number 5A, Federal Identifier. That should be your PHA code, for example, MD035. Question number 5B, Federal Award Identifier. You may leave this blank. Questions 10, 11, 12, and 13 are pre-populated, so please don't change them. Again, 10, 11, 12, or 13 are related to the program name, the CFDA number, etc. Please don't change them. Let's go over to question number 14 on the 424, areas affected by project. You can also leave this box blank. Question 15, a descriptive title of the applicant's project. Again, we suggest that you use the name of your PHA plus a program name. For example, Anytown Housing Authority _PHFSS. Question 16, Congressional District of Applicant. If the location of the applicant's office and the location of the program or project is within the same congressional district, you should include both answers. You should include the same answer for both parts. Let's move over to question number 16 on SF424. your project proposed start and end date. So we always have lots of questions. What should this information, how should you fill this out? For FSS this year, again, all applicants should estimate the day after the end of your current grant as the start date, or 3 months after the due date of the NOFA. Either way, again, these are going to be general estimates, and the actual dates will be determined at the grant agreement. Let's move over to question number 18, estimated funding. In 18A, again, that is the amount that you're requesting. Include the dollar amount for fringe benefits if applicable. Please do not enter any amounts on any other parts of question 18. The total will be pre-populated once you answer question 18A. Moving over to question 19, answer C. No, the program is not covered by Executive Order 12372. And lastly, for the 424, please do not add any attachments to this document. Use the attachment form in the electronic application to submit attachments and/or fax attachments. Next form that often gives applicants trouble is the SFLLL. And I'll say this from the beginning. If it's not applicable, do not submit it with your application. Again, the SFLLL is the disclosure of lobbying activities form. Again, if it's not applicable to you, please do not include it with your application. Another mandatory form is the HUD 2880, the Applicant Recipient Disclosure Update Report form. And again, depending on how you answer these questions, you'll be required to complete Part 1 and/or Part 2. Here's a quick screenshot of what that HUD 2880 looks like. Everyone should be answering yes to question number 1. If answer to question number 2 applies only to this application. So it should be yes if you're requesting more than $200,000 for this grant. If you answer yes to both parts of this form, you must fill out parts 2 and part 3. The next item is the HUD Form 96011. Again, that fax cover sheet. Again, it is required that all applicants provide this transmittal fax sheet, even if you don't have any faxes that you're attaching. On the top of the box, I believe it says what's the name of the form. You can just write no faxes with this submission, and for the number of pages, just select 1. Just as the fax number was last year, 1-800-HUD-1010, you could also use the same fax number this year. Okay. If you're not able to fax to that 800 number, you can use the 215-825-8798. The second part that I want to discuss today is the application instruction. Again, this is where your other mandatory forms will be held. Okay. Again, I did a quick screenshot of what this will look like, and you'll see that the application instruction contains the general section of the NOFA, the program NOFA, the HUD 52651, as well as the logic model. Let's talk briefly about the HUD Form 52651. Remember, Part 1 must be completed by all applicants. This is providing some basic information about their housing authority, about the applicant. All applicants must check PHA is currently administering an FSS program in Part 1 under the applicant category. Next, the boxes for the type of FSS program, either HCV or PHFSS, that should be left blank. In Part 2, again, depending on the situation, you'll complete this differently. If you are funded under the FY 2011, 12, or 13 HCV FSS and/or the Public Housing FSS NOFA, or you've received an FSS program through a transfer or consolidation from a PHA that was funded under such NOFA. Part 3 is not applicable to this NOFA. Again, we're not funding any new PHAs or new applicants. Again, for more detailed information about how to complete the 52651, go back to your NOFA, please, the program NOFA. The next item is the HUD Form 96010, the logic model. A couple of things that we'll ask. Please download the logic model that was included in the FY14 application package. Do not use a previous version of the logic model, and please don't make it into a PDF form. As you're looking at the logic model, we want you to read the instructions very carefully. And you always start entering information with the cover sheet tab. So just as you've entered information that was populated throughout the SF424, information that you type here on the cover sheet, it will be placed elsewhere. Okay. Only the cover sheet, the worksheet, and the reporting tabs are used to enter information. All the other tabs that you see back there, they're just references or instructions. Okay. So you really have three tabs that you'll be working with. Good. Want to continue with the logic model. Again, it has the same functionality and the contents that you had last year under the FY13 logic model. However, please note that due to a combination of the public housing and HCV FSS funding stream, applicants are required to only submit one logic model under this NOFA. However, please be sure that it includes projected measures for persons or households as applicable under both the public housing FSS and HCV FSS. Please do not submit two logic models. We need one logic model that combines information for both programs. Want to continue on with the logic model. Again, just as you saw in the FY13 logic model, you also have to project, or you also have to provide a projection for every activity or output and every outcome that's listed, even if the projection is 0. So I want to cover this really quickly. At the time of the submission of your annual logic model report, you may enter a number other than 0 in the annual column, even if you previously entered 0 in the projection column for the same activity, output, or outcome, only if you engaged in the activity or achieved the outcome during the reporting period. If you did not engage in the activity or achieve the outcome as you had originally projected, you must enter 0 in the annual column. Again, really quickly, to kind of wrap up the logic model, you'll see that there are 9 tabs in the logic model. And again, we're more concerned with the cover sheet, the worksheet, and the reporting tab. Again, under the worksheet, you no longer see year 1, 2, 3, or final. And the other tabs that you see on the screen, goals, needs, etc., again, those are reference tabs. Again, if we can just look at that screen and sit really quickly, all activities, outputs, and outcomes are locked and they can't be changed. All projections, annual, or extension fields are unlocked. Okay? So again, there's no more going back and forth with unlocking and locking your logic model. Okay? For your application, fill in only the projection column. The annual and extension columns are not required right now. They're only used when reporting. Also, some changes to the logic model from previous years. They're no longer drop-down menus or choices. You'll see the following columns on the worksheet tab. They're pre-filled, and they're the same for both FSS programs: HUD goals, policy priorities, needs, services, activities, outcomes. Okay. Just as you saw in the previous or the FY13 logic model, the pre-column is now called projection. The post column is now called annual or extension, and there's no longer a YTD or year to date. Again, just as you saw in the previous logic model, there are no policy priorities to be chosen in the activities or outcomes. There are no policy priority status, and the number of management questions has been reduced. It's from over 20 to about 10 or 11. Again, same thing applies as you did last year. Your local HUD field office will review the logic model with you before they send it to the initial database to have the projections aggregated. If you have any questions about the logic model format, the function, we're asking that you please call the Office of Strategic Planning and Management at the number listed in the instruction tab on the logic model. Please don't attempt to make any changes to the form yourself. Again, a quick note about reporting under the logic model. The logic model reporting is done on an annual basis. Okay, we always get lots of questions. Well, when are they due? Reports are due to the Public Housing Director in the recipient's local HUD field office no later than 30 days after the ending date of the one-year grant provided in the recipient under this NOFA. And again, you must respond to all management questions on the reporting tab. All grantees are also required to submit a completed SF425, the Federal Financial Report. Let's talk quickly about PIC reporting. Again, Reporting also includes entering information on the FSS addendum on the HUD 50058. For example, enrollment and exit reports are completed at the beginning and end of the family's participation in FSS. A progress report must be completed at least annually, so during each family's participation in the program. And if you have more questions, please look at PIH Notice 2011-65 for more details on FSS PIC reporting requirements. And again, we definitely encourage you to take this note very seriously. I want to jump over to reporting under VMS that Brianna mentioned earlier. In previous years, the amount of HCV FSS escrow deposits, the escrow forfeitures, and the HCV coordinator expenses were required to be entered into VMS, into HUD's voucher management system. PHAs must continue to enter the amount of HCV escrow deposits, as well as the forfeitures into VMS. However, due to the combined funding streams, PHAs will no longer use VMS to report HCV coordinator expenses for funds made available under this NOFA. However, please keep in mind, PHAs must continue to report HCV FSS coordinator expenses into VMS for HCV funds made prior to, made available under the FY13 HCV FSS NOFA. So again, VMS is not required for grantees under FY14, but it is required for applicants or for PHAs that were awarded under FY13 NOFA. I wanted to talk briefly about faxes. Again, I mentioned earlier, you should use the HUD 96011 as a cover sheet if you submit any fax attachments, or they will not be attached to your application. Secondly, entire applications will not be accepted. Entire applications submitted by fax will not be accepted. There may have been an applicant or two that got into a jam last year, and they had no choice other than to submit an application by fax, and then unfortunately it was not accepted. Another note about faxes is that please make sure that the cover sheet that you're using is from the same application package that you downloaded. It's especially important if you downloaded the application package more than once. Again, remember that the unique identifier on the fax transmittal sheet covering documents faxed in support of your application, if it does not match the unique identifier in your application, we won't be able to match your faxes. So again, if you've downloaded the application package more than once, make sure you have the correct facsimile transmittal sheet. Another quick note on faxes, and if you are resubmitting an application that was previously validated by grants.gov, you must refax all documents in support of your application after the resubmitted application has been validated. Again, you can look at the general section to get more details about this. I want to talk briefly about the SAM process, or Renewal Update Registration process for SAMs. So we spoke briefly this afternoon. You're required to be registered through grants.gov. You're also required to have an updated SAM, or System for Award Management registration. Okay? You are responsible for ensuring the accuracy of your agency's registration in SAM. The SAM registration must be renewed and revalidated at least every 12 months from the date that the applicant last certified and submitted the SAM registration. We had quite a few applicants last year that had an expired SAM, and they weren't able to submit their applications on time. If you have an issue with SAM, it may take you several weeks to get this worked out. So again, please go to the SAM or grants.gov website and find some additional information. But again, you have to take the time and make sure that your SAM registration is updated and validated. Again, you can also look at the general section for more information about the SAM update and registration process. Again, you can also go to the sam.gov website or contact their customer service at the number that you see on your screen. Okay, I spoke about it briefly. Let's move over to the grants.gov process. Again, most of this stuff is standard that you've already done for the last couple of years, but for those that aren't familiar with the process, in registration for grants.gov, again, it is a multi-step process that can take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks or longer if the information has not been resolved. Applicants that do not have a valid registration will not be able to submit an application through grants.gov. Please take the time now to make sure that you have an updated grants.gov and a sam.gov registration updates. I want to take a few minutes to talk about this if you are an authorized organization representative or AOR. If your AOR has changed, please follow the registration steps that you see on the screen to make sure that you have a new one registered and the authorized person is allowed to submit the application. First, you want to make sure that you complete your AOR profile on grants.gov and create a username and password. The DUNS number is needed to complete this step. Secondly, you want to make sure that the applicant organization's e-business point of contact, or e-biz POC, must log in to grants.gov and confirm the AOR. Thirdly, the AOR confirms that his or her status, again, as the authorized applicant to submit an application on behalf of the organization. If your e-biz has changed in the SAM registration, please make sure that the new e-biz point of contact has given permission to the person submitting the application to be the AOR. A registration checklist, a step-by-step registration instruction, as well as some other information about this process can be found at grants.gov. Again, you should be able to find most of your information about this process either via grants.gov or by contacting them on the help desk. Application submission. Again, before you can view and complete your application, you must have a compatible Adobe Reader installed. You can refer to grants.gov for downloading information and Adobe software and system compatibility information here. Regarding your application submission, I want to take a few minutes to talk about this. This is really important. The two forms in the application instruction download that everyone will need are Word documents, the HUD 52651 and the Excel form HUD 96010. These are both fillable and savable. You may save and attach as Word and Excel files. However, do not make them PDFs. You can also fax with the cover sheet if you prefer. The HUD 52651 in the instruction download was released on April 23rd. It was a PDF, and it was not fillable or savable. We've since made a change, and we've replaced that PDF with a fillable, savable Microsoft Word document as of 4/28. Please make sure that you download the instruction again to access the HUD 52651 as a Word document.
And I just wanted to add there that anyone who's already filled out their application doesn't need to go fill out everything over again. All you need to do to access the new Word document 52651 is to download the instructions, download again, grab that Word 52651 and fill that out. You can still use the SF424 and everything else that you've already completed. You don't have to do everything over again if you use the forms that were available on 423. The only change we made was to switch out the 52651 that used to be a PDF and is now a Word, and that's the only new thing you need to pull down and fill out. It should be good to go.
Good, great. Let's talk briefly about application submission regarding file names. So please don't get fancy and use any names longer than the approximately 50 characters. So don't use ampersands or percent signs, pound, or anything like that. Again, that always messes up the grants.gov submission process. If you use any of those files, more than likely your application will not be accepted. And again, just a quick note, and again, you probably saw in the list of common mistakes in the appendix, that this is one of the main errors in the FY13 competition. Some other application hints. The grants.gov website has lots of information on registering. We also receive several calls on how to register, what should I do if I have any technical issues with grants.gov. Unfortunately, our office can't answer a lot of those questions. So again, please use the grants.gov website as well as their help desk to help you be registered and have no problems there. Now, what happens after you've submitted your application? Okay, you've submitted your application, you think everything's fine, and well, It may or may not be, depending on your situation. After your application has been received, your application still has to be validated by grants.gov. In that validation process, that's what is forwarded to HUD. Again, your application has to be validated, and it also has to be, it has to be checked for errors. If you receive an email that says rejected with errors, you're required to either submit the new application or to fix the errors that you received in that most recent email. Okay. Again, to know whether or not your application was rejected with errors and the reasons why, you can go to grants.gov, select Applicants from the top navigation bar, and select Track My Application from the drop-down list. Again, so once you've submitted your application, if the status says rejected with errors, again, you have the option to correct those errors and resubmit your application before the grace period ends. Now, if your application was rejected with errors and you do not correct the errors before the application grace period ends, HUD will not review your application. Again, remember, if you're resubmitting your application that was previously validated by grants.gov, you must refax all documents faxed in support of your application after it was resubmitted. What else happens after you've submitted your application? If your application status is, it currently says validated, your application will be forwarded to HUD by grants.gov. So please don't assume that the application has been successfully submitted until you receive the validation notice. The department recommends that applicants submit their applications at least 48 hours before the deadline. A submission attempt less than 48 hours before the deadline, it may not allow for you to, it may not allow enough time for you to do the correct research, fix it, and submit your application on time. Again, if your application is received by grants.gov before the deadline, but it's rejected with errors, you have a grace period of 1 day beyond the application deadline to submit the corrected application that was received and validated by grants.gov. Again, there is no grace period for paper applications. Again, application status. You want to look for two things. Your application has been reviewed by the grantor agency and assigned an agency tracking number. That's the indication that your application has been received and validated. A few application status hints. If there's a problem with your application submission, an email will be sent to the person designated in your grants.gov registration, not your application, because we haven't been able to read your application yet. Okay? It hasn't gotten to us yet. So please make sure that the person designated in your registration is checking his or her emails in anticipation of a validation email. Again, we received several calls or emails last year. I never received an email. Again, the AOR, the person registered via grants.gov, that's the person that's going to receive the email saying that your application was validated or rejected.
Right. And even if you don't end up getting an email for whatever reason, it's the responsibility of the applicant to actually actively track their application on grants.gov. Not getting an email saying that you were rejected isn't a justification. You have to actively check to make sure that it was validated. So make sure you do that.
Good. Great. A few other hints. Always make sure that someone will be available to cure any deficiencies, both at the time of application submission and during the competition processing times. If at any point, if the point of contact for the application goes on vacation, so please have someone designated to cover for them. Okay. A few other hints. If you do have any technical issues, or even if you don't, so please make sure that you save every email, correspondence, email validation, the log number, every time that you call a help desk, etc. This will be really important if our office or another office has to do some research to find out what the problem was with your submission. We also ask that you save all fax transmission sheets. Now, Brianna mentioned it a little while ago where under the FY14 funding, so we're going from an updated ACC to a grant agreement, and we're using the line of credit control. Now, if you're required to submit a LOX voice response system authorization form, again, there are several scenarios. You don't have to do it now, but you don't have to wait until the notification of your award either. Let's look at a couple of scenarios. and who this line of credit control VRS authorization form is applicable to. So first, any PHA without access to locks, without prior access to locks. Again, this is mostly the HCV FSS only PHAs. Again, you're required to complete and submit the locked VRS authorization form. The second group, any PHA with access to locks but has no access to the ROS program area. Again, so those PHAs that administer public housing but have never been funded in public housing FSS. You must complete and submit a LOCKS VRS authorization form. The third group, PHAs with access to locks and the ROS program area. Again, those are PHAs that have been funded for PHFSS in the past. You do not need to submit a LOCKS VRS authorization form. Okay. So again, we have three categories. Those HCV FSS only PHAs, you must complete and submit. Okay. Those PHAs that have access to locks but don't have access to the ROS program area, you must submit. And those PHAs that had access to locks and they were funded under public housing FSS last year or previous years, you do not need to submit anything. This is a quick snapshot of what the LOCKS VRS form looks like. If you're not familiar with it, you can either go to at the website that you see on your screen, or simply go to HUD's website and type LOCKS, LOCCS. Make sure that the form that you're looking at has a November 2016 expiration date. Again, really quickly, a couple of important keys on the LOCKS VRS authorization form. For PHAs without access to locks, again, you must complete this form and submit the authorization form. Okay. In Block 1, please indicate that you're a new user and you want to add a new program or tax ID. You also want to indicate ROS in Section 5A, where it says LOCKS program area, and in Section 5B, program name, and make sure that you're entering Family Self-Sufficiency. The next group that we discussed, the PHAs with access to locks, but no access to the ROS program area. Make sure also in Block 1, you indicate add new program area or tax ID. You also want to indicate ROS in Section 5A under LOCKS program area, and Family Self-Sufficiency in Block 5B. PHAs with access to locks and under the ROS program that have been funded for public housing in the past, again, you do not need to submit an authorization form. Some quick instructions on completing that VRS access authorization form. You'll see a block where it has approving official. Again, the approving official is more than likely a CEO, it could be a board chair, but again, the approving official, they must complete Block 7 of this form. If you already have LOCKS access and you don't know who your agency's approving official is, please contact your local HUD field office and they should be able to provide you with the information. Please do this before you submit the authorization form. If you're not sure, again, just give someone at your local HUD field office a call and they should be able to provide you with this information. Okay. Once the form has been completed, you have to mail it to your public housing director in the local HUD field office. They will then review it. They'll complete Block 9, where it says HUD Program Office Point of Contact, and they will mail it to HUD's CFO User Support Division. You cannot complete this form yourself and mail it directly to the User Support Division. It has to come from a local HUD field office representative. If you need more information on grants.gov, we strongly encourage you to look at the grants.gov website. Also use their help desk, and also use the grants-gov.blogspot.com. If at all possible, again, do not contact the program office with grants.gov related questions. Again, we just won't be able to help you. If you need help with SAM, and again, this is a critical part that several applicants missed last year, contact the SAM.gov help desk between the hours of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. And again, remember that some of these SAM.gov related issues can take many, many, many weeks. I think we had one applicant last year to where it took them over 3 weeks to get something resolved, and unfortunately the application deadline had passed and they weren't able to submit their application on time. Some general contact information regarding the 2014 general section. Call the Office of Strategic Planning and Management, the Grants Management Office and Oversight Division, the Grants Management and Oversight Division at the number listed on your screen. If you have questions about the logic model, again, call the number that's listed in the instructions of the logic model. If you have locks related questions, if you have any issues about the access process or you're experiencing any problems accessing locks, please contact the User Support Division at the number that you see on the screen, or you can send them an email. Again, if you have any program office related questions or NOFA related questions that are particular to the FSS program, please email us at fss@hud.gov. A few other important resources before we conclude the presentation and get to questions. You can also go to HUD's Funds Available page, or you can go to hud.gov, search grants, and click Funds Available.
Okay.
All right. Again, I think that concludes the section that I wanted to cover, some of the more technical pieces of it. I know I kind of went through it really quickly, but again, if you have questions related to grants.gov, contact grants.gov. SAM, contact SAM. Again, our office, unfortunately, we're just not able to provide that type of support.
Okay, and if anybody has any questions for us right now, we're available to answer questions. Please submit your questions to fss@hud.gov. Okay, we actually already have a question. Somebody asked where they should submit the corrected PIC numbers. So I'm assuming that what this question is referring to is that somebody looked at the PIC numbers in Appendix D, PIC report, and they're too low. This is one of the categories of the people who have to submit documentation to confirm the correct number of HCV FSS and public housing FSS participants. That documentation gets submitted with the application. It doesn't come to anyone else outside of the application process. It goes along with your application. And if for whatever reason you did not submit it with your application and you were required to, it will be a technical deficiency, and you will have an opportunity to submit it during the technical deficiency process. Okay, we've got another question. Somebody asked us to clarify whether or not a statewide program with multiple sites needs to submit documentation of size of each program, or if the PIC count is sufficient to support their request, perhaps they don't have to submit any additional information. Okay, so basically what this is getting at is in the NOFA, we have said that if you are a state or regional PHA that administers the program in separately administratively distinct areas, we will apply the eligibility requirements, number of families served, to each of your administrative areas. And if you are submitting documentation to confirm the correct number of HCV FSS and public housing FSS participants, you would need to identify each of the separate administrative areas and listing out the names and the number of participants in each of those areas. But as the questioner pointed out, that you may find that your PIC report in Appendix D has enough families to support your renewal positions. Let's say it's showing that you have 75 families and you're only asking for 2 renewal positions. In that case, you don't need to submit documentation to contest that, so you don't need to submit anything showing the separate administrative areas. You'll only show the separate administrative areas and the families and the names of the families in each of those areas if you are a state or regional PHA who is required to submit the documentation. So look at the list of the 5 reasons you would be required to submit that documentation. And if you're not required to submit the documentation, you don't need to submit it. Are there any other questions? Okay, looks like we have another one. Somebody said, are we limited to both the cap on the positions and the amount of money that we can require? Many of our positions were originally funded several years ago, and those original requests are insufficient to support the staff costs. So We've heard this concern from multiple PHAs. Those salary caps have been frozen for a couple of years. And it is true that we're not raising the salary caps. It's still $69,000 for a full-time position, $34,500 for a part-time position. Those are the caps. And in addition to those caps, the questioner is correct that we are doing a cap on the funding amount for renewal positions. So if your cap on your funding amount for renewal positions is $100,000, you can't get any more than $100,000 for your renewal positions. And if your cap on your renewal positions is 2, you can't get any more than 2 renewal positions. Of course, there is the opportunity to apply for new positions if you want a 3rd position, and you can request that 3rd position up to $69,000 if you have salary comps to support that amount in your community. So there is an opportunity to request new positions under the NOFA, but there's not an opportunity to request an increase on the amount of funding you get for your renewal positions. It's capped by the total amount of renewal funding that you've gotten in the recent years of NOFAs. So it looks like we don't have any other questions right now. So you can feel free to submit questions to fss@hud.gov. Okay, sorry, one new question just came in. They ask, if we don't have a need for any new positions and we are submitting a renewal application, will we have to include any additional documentation other than the grants.gov application? Well, it depends. If you're in one of those 5 categories of people who have to submit documentation to confirm the number of HCV FSS and public housing FSS participants during the target period, you may be required to submit the documentation. So look at those 5 categories. One of them is RAD PHAs, for example. If you're one of those, you do need to submit that documentation. Okay. Well, so it looks like we might not have any questions right now. So feel free to submit to fss@hud.gov. And if we, for whatever reason, don't get to your question that you have submitted, some questions may not be applicable to multiple applicants. So we may have submitted a question that we haven't answered yet, and we will respond to you directly after the broadcast is over. And I think there might be another question coming in. Okay, if you are only applying for HCV FSS, do we have to update the LOCS 5A to add ROS? Okay, that's a good question. So this year, funding is combined. There's no distinction between HCV FSS and public housing FSS funding, really, under this NOFA. I think the question is, if we're applying for funding and we only run an HCV FSS program, do we have to submit LOCS? And the answer is yes. Every single grantee under this year's NOFA will be getting their awards through LOCS. LOCS only. There will be no amendments to an ACC contract. So even if you only run HCV FSS and you've never done LOCS before for your FSS program, you're going to have to this year. So the LOCS information does apply to you. Somebody asked, can the PHA request an increase in the salary from the amount that was funded last year? So this is a little tricky. Basically, no is the short answer, but you need to look at the cap on the funding amount for renewal positions. You can never go above that cap. You can, if that cap includes funding for multiple positions, you can switch around the amounts in each of those positions as long as you don't go above the cap, but you can never get more than the cap on the funding amount for renewal positions. Wait a second more because I think another question is coming in. And again, if you have any questions that you want to submit, you can send them to fss@hud.gov. And if we don't get to them during the presentation, we will email you directly after the presentation to respond to your question. Okay, we'll just give it a minute more maybe, and then if we don't have any more questions, we will sign off. We'll just wait one more minute. Okay, somebody asked, we qualify for the renewal HCV FSS as a primary. Can we include an application to include new FSS coordinator for public housing FSS with a RAD commitment? I'm a little unclear on what this question is, but if it's talking about joint applicants, then the answer is you cannot add a new co-applicant this year if you have not applied with that applicant before. Joint applicants are basically frozen in the way that I described earlier in the presentation. If you have not applied previously with a co-applicant, you cannot add one this year. If you did apply with a co-applicant last year, you cannot apply separately from them. But you could remove a co-applicant from your application if you want, or you could switch the co-applicant to a lead applicant or vice versa. Okay, somebody asked, how much can a new applicant apply for? So let me talk briefly about this. Funding category 3, again, is for PHAs that have the RAD choice mobility priority who were not funded in fiscal year 11, 12, or 13. So you could consider this a new applicant. One of the requirements is that they're currently administering an FSS program. So they're already administering FSS, but they weren't funded in the last 3 years, and they have the RAD choice mobility priority. How much can they apply for? PHA in that category is limited by a couple of factors. You have to have the number of families in your program to justify your request. So if you're asking for one full-time position, you need 25 families. If you're asking for part-time, you need 15. If you're asking for 2 full-time coordinators, you need 75, and so on, according to the formula in the NOFA. In terms of the amount you can ask for each of those coordinators, it's up to the salary cap, $69,000 for full-time, $34,500 for part-time, and of course you have to have salary comparables to justify that. So if your community shows that a full-time position similar to an FSS coordinator, a case manager like an FSS coordinator in your community gets paid $50,000 on average, you can't request $69,000. You would request $50,000 because that's what salary comparables show in your community.
Looks like another question may have come in. If we have multiple positions, do we have to still divide responsibilities between public housing, HCV, or can they serve both populations? I believe Brianna mentioned under this NOFA, under awards under this NOFA, excuse me, you can serve both populations. However, FY 13, 12, 11, since those NOFAs were funded under separate NOFAs, you have to serve those populations separately. However, under the 14 funding awards, you can serve both populations.
Right. So what that means is that some agencies, by the time they get their 14 money, they're out of any prior money, and all they have is the 14. All the coordinators that are funded with that money can go ahead and serve HCV and public housing FSS participants equally. It doesn't matter. Some PHAs are still going to be using, for example, some fiscal year 13 money. And any coordinator that is funded with that money, any money that is earlier than the fiscal year 14 NOFA, is restricted to serving only the participants that NOFA was for. So if you've got somebody on staff who is an HCV FSS coordinator and you'd like them to be able to serve public housing now as well, that person can, as long as they're being funded with the 14 funds. If you're still funding them with 13 funds or any earlier funds, they're still restricted to the HCV program because the funds under those prior years were restricted by Congress to the HCV FSS program. That's why they're restricted in that way. Okay, there's another question coming in. Somebody's asking that they were last funded in 2011, and during the target period, they maintained 100 participants. And they're asking if they can apply for a full and a part-time position since they currently have 65 participants. So it really depends on how many renewal positions this PHA has. If they have 1.5 renewal positions, for example, they were recently funded for 1 full-time HCV FSS coordinator and a part-time public housing FSS coordinator, their cap on their renewal positions is 1.5, and they can request 1.5 positions. However, if their renewal positions is only 1, you cannot request a new position as a part-time position. The only time you can request a new position as a part-time position, if you have any renewal positions, is in order to bring a part-time renewal position up to a full-time renewal. So if you have any renewal positions and you want to request a part-time new, You can only request a part-time new position if you're doing that so that you can bring a renewal part-time up to a full-time. You can't just go from 2 renewal positions to 2.5 because you're requesting a half-time new position. You can't do that. You could go from 2.5 to 3, but you can't go from 2 to 2.5. The 2 being the renewal and the half being the new. You can't do that. Hope that was clear. Okay, so I think we're out of questions. So I want to thank everybody for participating. And we will answer any questions that came in that we weren't able to get to directly via email at fss@hud.gov. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Good. Thank you.